Aloha and welcome to another episode of Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin, and today we'll be talking about designing smarter growth with community planning and better blocks. We're joined by Matt Gonser, the community extension agent for focusing on community planning and design at the Mānoa Sea Grant College program.
Correct.
Quite the mouthful.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about what is Sea Grant? What do you do there?
Sure. So Sea Grant actually is a national program. We are one of, it's either 32 or 33 programs across the country located in all the coastal states and Great Lakes, and there's one developing program along Lake Champlain. And it's built on the land grant model, which was developed in the 1860s, focused on developing, training, research, outreach, and education to really get our agricultural and mechanical professions in line. Fast forward a century, and you're in the 1960s, and the federal government acknowledged that there were a lot of coastal issues that could use a similar model of research, education, and outreach. Traditionally focused on fisheries, obviously fisheries catchment. However, that's transitioned over the last several decades as other coastal economies, such as tourism, case in point right here in Hawaii.
Popular,
yeah. The tourism economy became much more important, and we're sort of shifting and reassessing some of those topics of interest for Sea Grant program, both locally and nationally.
And so, do you know, was Mānoa initially a land grant college?
Yeah, so Mānoa actually is a land grant, sea grant, sun grant, and space grant university. It's
we've got it all.
We have it all. It's one of less than a handful of universities that can claim all of those. But the land grant system is just that. States were provided land to develop these institutions. It's where you got a lot of the state schools or things like Texas A&M, the A&M, agriculture and mechanical. Yeah.
So that was during a time when agriculture was a much larger portion of our national economy.
Yeah, and our land grant portion is the CTAR, the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources.
And so Sea Grant, so you're talking about focusing on coastal issues, initially fisheries. How does that fit into community planning and design? Or where's that overlap?
Sure. So one of the more important coastal management policies is the Coastal Zone Management Act, and it just so happens that in Hawaii, it encompasses every portion of every island, whereas in some other states, it's a sliver along the coast. And that's a true acknowledgement of the fact that everywhere in Hawaii is a coastal community. So you could think about some of the issues that impact our nearshore. It could be fisheries, it could be tourism, and we approach it in the sense that, except for, say, perhaps the over-extraction of fish or things like coastal hazards that are coming from offshore, all the things that we're dealing with in our nearshore environment are consequences of actions that we take on land. So, long story short, we get involved in some of the urban design, community design, stormwater management, the whole gamut, to acknowledge that we cannot just be in the cleanup business.
Well, and I would think also, thinking historically on civilizations, that human populations tend to cluster around coastlines, right? And waterways and things like that. So there's an inherent sort of historical relationship that our species has with coastal zones, but then now also through Sea Grant, you're looking at mechanisms to sort of reduce the impact of those, of our settlements on coastal resources?
Sure. That's one of the premises of community design, environmental stewardship. The relationship with the land and the environment is of critical importance. So there's really no action that doesn't have some kind of environmental, some quality of environmental degradation. So besides certain restoration efforts, everything we do has an impact. So we're really just trying to reduce our impact and figure out ways to allow these systems to sustain and thrive through time.
Well, it sounds like you're very much addressing sort of sustainability in the islands then.
Sure, yeah. You could say that.
Are there particular facets of what Sea Grant is up to that sort of end up in your lap? Because I would imagine that there are various sort of niche programmings going on.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just actually take a step back. So we as a Sea Grant program are located throughout the state, as well as in American Samoa and Micronesia and Mānoa. So we have extension agents located across the Pacific, but it's all housed within the UH system. And we have people that have cost share positions with state and county agencies to provide some of that technical assistance. And the slew of activities that we do is very diverse. That we have over 30 extension agents across the state. We operate and maintain the education program out at Hanauma Bay. We have a really top-notch marine science education program which works with K through 12 educators. All that said, the work that I am engaged in is on community planning, urban design, and since I am housed here at UH Mānoa, I really don't always have the opportunity to work across the full spectrum of our conservation, rural to urban settings, and have tended to focus a lot of my efforts in the urban core of Honolulu.
And so as an extension agent, sort of once again kind of borrowing from that initial model of extension agents in the land grant, where that would be folks coming out and helping you assess problems with your soil, your crop production, in some way then your role is?
Sure, yep. I mean, the same way that you can sort of take that scientific method and approach it to agricultural systems or other systems, we can look at our urban form or the way we move about, the way we live, and do rather rigorous assessments, and from those findings inform, here are potential trade-offs, pros and cons of one method or another. So providing those kinds of scenarios, sort of if this, then that, is really what urban planning is based on, acknowledging that urban systems, and it's really social systems that are that complex, and the trade-offs and the wants and desires versus the things that we are actually able to provide for our citizens through government function or public-private partnerships. It's trying to navigate that, but it's really based on research and extending and providing that information to help make informed decisions.
So part of your task then is to glean from the various research happening around the world, I would imagine, and then particularly at UH, best practices or opportunities to work with both sort of urban form as well as what we could maybe term the sort of invisible systems or the invisible structures, the social components that really drive our economy, our islands, and trying to find ways to massage those into a more...
Well, Sea Grant, maybe I should even take another step back. We are neutral brokers of information. We're a non-advocacy group because without that level of non-advocacy, we would diminish our trustworthiness. You know, our ability to continue to provide for our coastal communities is really built on that trust. And we were actually one of the oldest Sea Grant programs. I believe 1972 is when we were instituted. And I'm just the beneficiary of the respectable work that has come before. So really upholding that it's through the provision of information, we hope certain outcomes are the result of it.
But you hope those outcomes quietly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I guess more broadly, then those outcomes I would guess are largely based on sort of ocean ecosystem metrics to some degree.
A little bit. Although I do dabble in certain things that maybe don't have a direct connection, at least in the minds of citizens, government agencies with the nearshore environment. I mean, anything that you look at any certain initiatives, like the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, there's a big component of that, which is transportation. So, okay, we know that transportation requires energy. We know that we're importing that fuel from elsewhere. But we also know that things like tires and brake pads and asphalt get into our storm drainage system.
Yep.
So trying to reduce some of the strains on those systems through walkability, compact neighborhoods, bikeability, those kinds of livability measures also provide you some of those downstream benefits of cleaner waters.
So you're working upstream from the problem both literally and figuratively then.
Yes.
And addressing that through transportation, form, walkability, and sort of a variety of different aspects. And it sounds like to me that a lot of this, and the reason that I wanted to have you in and chat with us, is that this really kind of gets at what some of these broader aspects that we can start working towards in terms of sustainability in the island. What does sort of sustainability in the context of your work look like, or how do you conceptualize an interaction between sustainability and Sea Grant, or your particular actions, or does that play in?
So I mean, when you take a phrase like sustainable community development, right? It's not just the physical components. It's also a lot of the social, psychological, our own happiness and joy. The economics cannot be downplayed at all. Just understanding that tourism as both a stress on our own environmental systems, but also the economic benefits. You can't really dissociate the two, and there's a lot of other measures such as that. But you know, how we live, how we get about. We'd mentioned before, like the food that we eat. Those sort of like three big components that feed into what can perhaps make a place sustainable. How we interact. In terms of the work that I'm engaged in, it's working with a lot of the TOD plans for the city, heavily, again, focused on the urban
transit-oriented
development, acronyms. And the courses of action, because planning, community planning, right, that's one component. That has a whole different time frame. Community design, that's more the implementation of some of those plans. So a lot of the things that we're looking at now is assessing where we are today, is really just a reflection of certain decisions that were made in the past. So let's evaluate those and see, okay, are we comfortable with the trajectory that we're on? If not, then what are other courses of action that we could potentially take?
Well, I think you had made mention of trade-offs, right? And I feel like that often sustainability is often phrased as sort of a flat subject matter, where it's like you're sustainable or you're not. It's sort of this black or white without much recognition of the considerable nuance within each of these decision-making aspects, right? So if it says, okay, we don't want to have a tourist economy, but we'd love to have some of that tourist income for our, roads, things like that. That there are inherently many decisions that need to be made, sort of just even within the sort of pantheon of sustainable practices or sustainable planning or community interactions. That it sounds like your work, particularly with planning in general, speaks to. And I think more broadly for myself, I often kind of conceptualize sustainability as sort of as this carrot that's sort of looming out in front of us, and you're never really there. It's only in hindsight that we can really define something as having, it was sustainable. It's really like our metric capacity is very limited because of, we can only measure so much. And that, I don't know, I was reading something the other day that had said, like, oh yeah, I've been operating a sustainable farm for 3 months. And somebody else had commented, they're like, how exactly do you know you're sustainable? You've been there for 3 months.
Yeah.
Like, and so that it ends up being this almost impossible to define in the moment notion, which then it very much becomes about what plans were set in place.
Sure, I mean, I would say it's aspirational,
yeah.
if anything, and we can measure. We can set our own goals using the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative as a case in point. Like we've set goals and we're moving towards it, but that's a multi-decade track, and we won't really know if we've gotten there until we get there, and then we measure it again. And it's you need those cycles of learning to reassess and see if you're moving towards a more sustainable. Because we tried to. Earlier today, we were saying, what's the opposite of sustainable? And I'm not sure we really have an understanding of what that is, but we define sustainable as, making sure that there are resources for some number of generations thereafter. But we don't know because we're not there.
We aren't those generations
thereafter, right? So sustainability is trying to work against the depletion of certain resources, but it doesn't mean we have to continue to use any one particular resource, right? We can drop oil altogether and move towards something else, and it's finding those ways towards a cleaner, brighter future, sort
happier,
of the happier,
healthier,
those aspirational things, which, to be honest, are really written into things like our state constitution. It's the legacy of the Native Hawaiian culture. It's in our state 2050, our Hawaii Sustainability 2050 plan. Like it's all stuff that we have signed on to in some way or another, and believe is an important path, but it's making those decisions and it's choices and trade-offs, both environmental, economic, how we tax, how we generate revenue. And that's, the notion is easy, and it's a no-brainer. But
if you were like, I don't know about this sustainable living on the planet, let's destroy everything, isn't really an ethos that's popular.
And it's not easy to live simply. We're sort of wrapped up in this consumer capitalist. Again, we may want a certain lifestyle, but having, say, like the greenest home off in green pastures, but you still have to commute by some form other than people-powered movement to get downtown, you're probably, because of that transportation component, not going to be as green as someone who lives in a 100-year-old building downtown and walks to work. Yeah. So it's trying to identify some of those trade-offs and really talk through them.
Well, lots of trade-offs. Well, we're going to trade off to a commercial break. When we come back, we'll hear a little bit more about smart growth and some of the things that we can do to get involved.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Mānoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year, it is on April 6th, 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all-ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between. Everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin, and today we're talking about designing smarter growth through community planning and better blocks. We're joined by Matt Gonser, the extension agent in the community planning and design subsection of the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College program.
It's lengthy.
I'm working on it. We need an acronym, and possibly an acronym for that.
Grant.
UHC Grant would make it easier. And so you were just talking about some of those inherent trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And so with community planning and design, sort of a notion that's become, or gained rapid growth, we could say, is this concept of smart growth. So what is smart growth? Does that play into what you're working on professionally? And then how do you conceptualize that as being applicable or not to the islands?
Sure. I would add to that smart growth really is not a new notion. We have a lot of remnants of certain neighborhood design here in Honolulu and Oahu and across the state. Sort of your small village where people live, work, and play. It's all about proximity and then knowing each other, and again, some of those other social systems that we talked about. But smart growth also has economic considerations. So through taxes, that's how we pay for things like infrastructure or schools and government. We've seen it across the country as we have more decentralized populations, more far-flung infrastructure. It's difficult to maintain and repair some of that stuff.
So that would be sprawl.
Sprawl, yeah. In one, which can be better defined and measured, but sure, sprawl development, acknowledging that, and smart growth is about trying to focus resources, both people, the money, the infrastructure, in places where we already are before taking over some of those greener pastures.
So sort of looking at how do we revamp areas that we're already inhabiting as opposed to growing outward, sort of an intensification as opposed to extensification.
Sure, yeah, you could say that.
Are there,
I saw an image, sorry.
Are there, well, let's pop that up. So
sure.
What's going on in here?
So this image is really a legacy of a changing transportation system. What it shows is the number of pedestrian fatalities on Oahu from 2003 to 2012 in a report by a nonprofit called Smart Growth America. It was entitled Dangerous by Design. So our road systems, as the automobile became an extremely important and useful form of getting about, it changed the way the public right-of-way, which is for all users and all people, it's actually our largest area of public space. How the design and the progression to get flow through really impacted our ability to move in other modes. Hawaii has the badge of dishonor of having the highest pedestrian fatality rate for people 65 years and older. Yeah. Not only that, in about 15 years, a quarter of the population will be over 65 years old. So thinking about smart growth, another movement is complete streets, which is really just a component, and they're all really tied in. It's important to label things so people can kind of wrap their heads around them, but they're all tied together of how to make a place more livable and more sustainable. This image right here shows Pensacola at the intersection of Kapiolani, and it shows that you have to go, if you're a pedestrian and say you're at the design center, but you really want to get to the Pancake House, you can't make a beeline straight across the street. You got to go 3 ways, because this road is now a couplet, meaning 2 parallel roads that run in opposite directions. So Pi'ikoi and Pensacola, they function really well to get automobiles through, but they cause certain issues for pedestrians as you're trying to move about the city. So the trade-off in this question is this something that we're comfortable with now? If not, what else do we want to do? If we are comfortable with it, sure, it works.
Do we want to change it? And
Right.
what would that look like? I know that,
Correct.
I mean, sort of some of the initial aspects of roads as public space, I think in the 20s and sort of before the real sedimentation of car culture in the United States, was that roadways were a public space, were a space for commerce, for interaction, and that there was considerable issue taken up with how cars were first being integrated, and that there had been I think it was a 99% Invisible lovely radio show was talking about how in early days that they had associated sort of this growing notion of car use with Morlock and this sort of evil lord gods that would be feasting upon children because so many people were dying as a byproduct. And that somewhere in that time, as you mentioned, sort of this flow through, that we just became more and more accepting of the notion of roads as a means to get from some place to another place, and that there wasn't necessarily another use of that public space that was acceptable. And so, the pedestrian space became marginalized further and further and further to now the point where, in some parts of the island, we're lucky to even have a sidewalk.
Yeah, and to bring it down to something that people may know, maybe we'll talk about this example first. So I live very close to the Alawai Canal, and this shows the Alawai Promenade. And the promenade itself is listed to go across Kalakaua Avenue, behind the convention center, behind the Foreign Legion along McCulley Street. But the reality of it is that you can't cross that many lanes of traffic safely. A, there's not a crosswalk. B, you're supposed to obviously obey the laws, and there are pedestrian laws as well, just like there are automobile laws. But back to those other 2 intersections, it's the similar situation that we just saw on Pensacola, where you have to cross 3 ways to get one way. But the trade-off is we can get a lot of people into Waikiki, which is very important both for locals and tourists. But just labeling something doesn't mean it's going to exist. So just to call something a lay of parks, which is an effort that we're working on in the city, and there are signs up around, there's certain disconnections. Yeah. And it's investigating in earnest those systems to see, is there room for improvement? If not, maybe we need to take a different tact.
So that lay of parks notion, sort of getting towards having a consistent kind of greenway running through the city. That
Kapiolani all the way down to Kaka'aka Waterfront Park. The vision is that there could be a continuous, you would never have to conflict with the automobile if you were riding your bike or walking, and you could travel over 8 miles through some of the best green spaces in the city.
That sounds like a lovely thing to be working towards.
But it's not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's resources, it's other forms of transit, and even working with communities can cause some challenges. And
so there's been some kind of urban exploration going in concert with this. I know there was a Jane's Walk event. Sure. So Jane's Walk is built. It's actually a group in Toronto, Canada. So Jane Jacobs, the namesake of Jane's Walk, is sort of it's difficult to go to planning school and not know Jane Jacobs, even though she was never a planner per se. She was a writer, but she was someone that lived in the community and had the wherewithal to observe the pros and cons of certain community design. So we, a group called Better Block Hawai'i, organized Hawaii, or Honolulu's first Jane's Walk. We dubbed it Walk Story because that was a much more tangible, again, bringing it down to something that we all understand a little bit better. Yeah. But it was really just about getting out and walking, helping to identify good urban design, bad urban design,
as we we were lined up in front of McKinley High School on a narrow sidewalk, and we had 30 people trying to cross, and all these cars were looking at us rather frustratingly.
Menacingly.
Yeah. And we keyed up someone from Parks Department to give us some history of Thomas Square. We had someone from City Planning talk about Blaisdell. We had someone from HCDA talk about some of the Kaka'ako stuff. The best part, it's hard not to notice a group of 30 people just kind of walking around. It looks a bit unusual. A resident of one of the buildings in Kaka'ako came out and gave us some history of his neighborhood. So those sort of serendipitous moments of like being out in community and learning about other people's spaces and places was really encouraging. And we will be doing it again. We're likely to have many more than just one walk. We're trying to engage high school students to help us organize and connect with their communities, and that would be the first weekend in May. So while it is our local effort, it's part of a global initiative.
And you said this is an effort of Better Block Hawaii. So tell
Better
us a
Block
bit about
Hawaii. It's a nonprofit, 501c3. Has a longer-term vision, but currently we're heavily engaged in just placemaking. And like I mentioned, things like the transit-oriented development plans. In talking through some of the possibilities for the future, it's difficult to envision them if there aren't local examples. So we're trying to help facilitate and envision what some of these changes may be, whether it's parklet systems, complete streets, and we do these small-scale demonstration projects to hopefully gain excitement, but also to gain feedback, because we're all going to be moving on this course together, and we have to figure it out together. And none of us individually know the answer, and collectively we have to figure out what works and what doesn't work for our various neighborhoods, let alone the whole city.
And so you guys have been involved with events like the Cyclovia, correct?
So that's actually where we
prior,
kind of, before we were Better Block Hawaii in name, we participated with Cycle on Hawaii, where they did a Cyclovia, which was, again, this is a global thing. The city of Bogota closes over 70 miles in their city every Sunday, just to provide people the freedom to move about and cycle and dance and do all those sorts of things. So we had a much smaller scale initiative, about 1.5 miles in Kaka'ako in 2013. But part of that Cyclovia event to promote health and wellness and mobility was to also use that as a chance to demonstrate some complete streets. So we went on Cook Street from Pohukaina down to Ala Moana Boulevard and installed, it's temporary, right? So you can't get the full effect. Also, unfortunately, we weren't able to still permit traffic to move through. We didn't really have the insurance to cover that kind of stuff. But the objective, obviously, with a complete street is that all modes, you don't close it to traffic, because traffic still has to get through, automobile traffic, I should say. So from there, we realized there were a lot of other, I'll say it was hugely successful, whatever measure you want to take, I don't know, but the governor and his dog came down, so that must be a sign of something. But from that, we learned that the city agencies were interested in doing more things like that. So through their great faith and trust and encouragement, they've allowed us to do some of these demonstration projects at the Transit-Oriented Development Symposium that's been on the past couple of years. We set up a small parklet at the King Street cycle track opening, and we've got some other things coming online for this calendar year. If you're interested, betterblockhawaii.com.
All right. And so that also grew out of a sort of a national entity, or
we believe the first group, just generally called Better Block, was a team of neighbors in one particular neighborhood in Dallas, and they said, what if we just tried stuff? This is our hood. Why can't we experiment and work with city, work against city, figure out ways to improve our own neighborhood? And that's really the model that we're trying to do with Better Block Hawaii. Again, we live in different neighborhoods. We don't know all the people in those neighborhoods. So through invitations, trying to engage and empower. A similar model really with the Sea Grant extension model. It's about capacity, a little bit trying to make ourselves obsolete and then move on to the next objective, because once something is able to stand up on its own, that's really the sign of success.
All right. Well, as a true measure of sustainability, one could say, or at least of the program. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break, but join us back here after these messages.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on ThinkTech. Aloha.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin. Today we're talking about designing smarter growth with community planning and better blocks. We're joined by Matt Gonser, the Community Planning and Design Extension Agent at the UH Grants College Program.
Thanks.
All right. And so we were just kind of rapping about walkability, better block Hawaii, smart growth, and it sounds to me like a lot of what you're involved with are these different types of engagement strategies, and really embracing what you had pitched as, or what you had explained as the Sea Grant model of like doing so with an unbiased perspective, and that Better Block in particular is sort of pitching this notion of like, here are some possibilities, and let's try them out, and let's be experimentational, and see what works and see what doesn't. And I think that's a really kind of a pretty engaging mechanism, because I feel like in some ways, certain portions of the community feel like much of the design, we could say, doesn't feel very designed for the city, or much of the planning that happens doesn't necessarily happen at the request or in the way that certain portions of the community feel like things should. And so this becomes a mechanism by which people can actually get engaged with crafting what their community looks like. And I think that growth of urban engagement is really important for sort of Honolulu going forward, particularly as we have these massive changes from rail and whatnot.
You phrased that much more eloquently than I did 10 minutes in the previous session.
Well, it's just cut and recycle.
Yeah.
It's a sustainability thing. So with all of this, I mean, smart growth and community planning and design, I mean, I guess it makes me wonder, is there any critique in this of sort of this smart growth model? And you had mentioned sustainable community development earlier, and I've definitely come across good critique saying like sustainable development, is that an oxymoron? You know, that the trappings of success that come from measurements of, say, GDP, you know, if something was free in a community and then becomes monetized, that increases GDP. Or if there's excessive or increasing amounts of money spent on healthcare, that increases GDP. Neither of those things are necessarily actually...
Or natural disaster and all the rebuilding from something like that.
Exactly. So that
measure in GDP will show an uptick. But there are other measures, like you said, critiques. So actually something through a couple of researchers here, one at HPU and one at UH Mānoa, looking at the genuine progress indicator. And there's a dozen or so different measurements. But what the GPI is probably a truer accounting of the impacts. So it's not just economic growth. You have to subtract the environmental degradation from that equation to get a truer accounting of what is our progress. And progress itself is, people have different measures. Even you had mentioned critique of smart growth and some of the stuff we were talking about of proximity and compact development and perhaps density, which can have different definitions. That's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with.
No.
But
I want my 2-car garage and my picket fence.
Sure.
My suburban, I want a cul-de-sac. We could all live on one-person cul-de-sacs.
Yeah, and then the government has to provide for the upkeep of that road. They have to maintain water mains and storm sewer systems. They have to get fire and ambulance and police service out there. So it's not so simple, right? And again, we don't have the answers. I live in a certain place because I had certain needs, and other people have other interests. But as we work on some of these goals, like the 2050 plan, the Aloha Plus Challenge, the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, changes will have to come because it has been almost collectively decided that the track that we're on is not sustainable. So being honest with ourselves and trying to assess and make really difficult decisions that will have impacts on people's daily lives and futures.
And you've been involved with the Hawaii Green Growth Initiative
Sure.
in some capacity, right? And that's what the smart growth,
Well,
smart
the Hawaii
community planning? Is it?
Yeah, if I'll try to do this rather quickly, but the Hawaii Green Growth Initiative is an offshoot of the Global Island Partnership. But even more succinctly here, there's something called the Aloha Plus Challenge, which sets 6 sustainability targets, and again, it's targets, right, at 2030. One of them is clean energy, heavily adopting from the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. There's solid waste reduction.
Which you'll hear more about next week.
Oh, excellent. I'll tune in. Natural resources management, green jobs and education, local food production and consumption, and then there's one called smart sustainable communities, which is obviously so loaded that...
As opposed to the unsustainable dumb communities.
Sure, but 2 terms that come up in that are livability and resilience, and it's investigating those trade-offs and how we make progress. I can tell you there have been no targets set for that one. It just says increase the livability and resilience, and then you can let the argument start.
Well, let's break those apart for a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, so livability seems like it's fairly, it's diffuse of a concept, but that it's sort of getting at, or we could maybe, I think of maybe human development index, things like health metrics, access to services. What do you think of in terms of livability in that context?
Similar, and I would say there are other annual measurements, even our State Department of Health through their physical activity and nutrition plan, which has a whole gamut of measures from access to food, provision of services, but one of their areas is, I think it's community planning, community design and access, which has a lot of those, how many people walk to school, how many people walk to work, how many people commute by bike. So that kind of measurement is happening now, and I would feel certain that some of those measures would become part of the Smart Sustainable Communities component, especially as the state and the counties make progress on their complete streets policies. But it's not just mobility and access. Where and how do you get food? Acknowledging that. Oh, sorry. So this image is it's called the Walk Score, and it takes a heat map, and it's based on certain measurements. It's really just on access to things and how close are those things. It doesn't evaluate whether a corner store is better than, say, a full-service grocer, or it obviously doesn't have certain information like farmers markets and access to that.
Or that people don't live on ridgelands.
Correct. That should be obvious. So I wouldn't be too concerned about some of those red areas.
The lack of walkability at the top of the coal allowance.
Yeah. Great trail systems, but I mean the point is, as we work on adopting some of our own measures, there are models out there that we can look into.
And so that's sort of addresses that livability notion. But when we talk about resilience, I mean, earlier you brought up our discussion about sort of the flip side of resilience being maybe degradation.
Yeah.
Or the flip side of
people
sustainability,
maybe,
rather.
Yeah. Sustainability, we thought maybe degradation or depletion. Some people hear resilience and they think maybe the opposite is vulnerability. I would say maybe it's really more like collapse. And there are examples of certain populations in human history of complete collapse.
I'd say most populations, probably.
Yeah, that's true. But resilience as a term that really has evolved from the field of psychology and then ecology to now work our way into natural disasters and sort of the urban planning.
Social sciences.
Resiliency is some components, some combination of stresses and shocks, where those shocks are really those episodic punches to the gut, like a hurricane or
acute.
A tsunami, acute.
Yeah.
But those stresses are really, I would say, those livability components. So our day-to-day burdens.
Sort of more chronic aspects.
Chronic aspects, yeah.
And so with resilience, I mean, you mentioned adaptivity. I mean, I think of, or vulnerability rather, and I think of sort of adaptivity and vulnerability as being sort of two sides of the same coin, in the same way that you brought up collapse and resilience. And in that, when we have greater vulnerability, that the communities tend to have better capacity for adapting, right? So if you get flooded annually, the likelihood of you being able to deal with that is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
If you get flooded once in your lifetime, it will be the most calamitous experience of your life, quite possibly. And so that in some ways, as we further reduce our experience of sort of the vagaries of the natural environment, or even, say, social or economic, as we reduce some of those vulnerabilities, that our adaptive capacity seems to decrease in some manner. And so it's sort of an interesting, as we talk about trade-offs, it's like, is there some level of acceptable vulnerability that can increase our adaptive capacity, and how much of that is tolerable, and then to what sort of scale of event, particularly acute event, do we want to size our things?
Yeah, so when you said tolerable, I immediately thought about risk, because risk exists. It just depends on how much risk we can tolerate.
Yeah.
And like you had said, if we're so protected that we're not that vulnerable, we don't really have the wherewithal to think about the possibility for exceeding our protection. So case in point, the 2011 tsunami waves in Japan, they were designed to a rather extreme situation, which was exceeded.
Yeah. Massive seawalls and things like that as well, all overrun. Right. Yeah.
And to confuse it even more, Grosvenor, which is a real estate firm based in London, they have properties all across the globe. So they wanted to assess the resiliency of the cities that they own property. And they looked at 50 major cities. I don't know how they defined major, probably population and economy. But they balanced, the measure of resilience was vulnerability versus adaptive capacity. So as you might imagine, places like Mexico City or not small, but highly populated Southeast Asian countries, but with small GDPs, they were both highly vulnerable and apparently lacked adaptive capacity. US cities fared well in the adaptive capacity, but only mostly on the measure that
we could buy our way out.
We get money from the government.
Yeah.
But is that sustainable? Probably not. So even thinking of the differences between sustainability and resiliency, it's not so cut or dry, because it's not snapshots, like you said in the beginning. Sustainability is not a snapshot. Resiliency is not a snapshot. There has to be continuous learning and measuring.
I think and I feel like in many ways, that resilience is the up and coming buzzword at this point, or really is the buzzword that's here. Sustainability, I feel like, had a similar trend of just being, slap it on both sides of whatever your project is, and you're golden. And then now that this concept of resilience and resiliency has kind of become nebulous in many ways. I often, when resilience is kind of bandied about, it's sort of like, resilience to what?
Or from what?
And from what? Or from what? Yeah, that most frequently it's just tossed out as, in many ways, as sustainability as a blanket notion without recognition of the considerable nuance and trade-offs involved with all of it.
Is it inherent, or is it something that's practiced in the face of some kind of acute shock? And I think thinking about it in the stresses and shocks, the dynamics between those two, that gets to livability and resilience, which we will hope to increase through certain actions and measures.
And so if you had sort of three major components or actions or steps to take towards a more, we could say, sustainable or resilient Hawaii, what things would you say are important to focus upon, or that you would push people towards to get involved with?
Just to be open to discussion. The more we can talk about these things, the better able and the increased capacity to actually move and make those difficult decisions, I think, will be really important. And last plug, the legislative session's theme this year is resiliency. So let's all try to figure that out.
Figure out what that means for them and for us. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today. Once again, Matt Gonser, Extension Agent in Community Planning and Design at UH's Sea Grant College program. I'm your host, Hunter Heaivilin. Join us here every Thursday for Sustainable Hawaii, a show about making the transition from being individual consumers with rights to building communities of producers with responsibilities.